Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Northern Ireland's leaders have appealed for calm after several days of street violence that has left more than 40 police officers injured. Tonight, the Parliament stormont has been recalled following a petition by the Cross-Community Alliance Party. Northern Ireland's First Minister, Arlene Foster, blamed malign influences for the violence in Londonderry and Belfast, where youths, sometimes children, according to police, have been torching vehicles and throwing petrol bombs. Tensions have become increasingly inflamed since January. The Unionist parties predominantly reject the introduction of new customs checks in the Irish Sea as a result of Brexit. But the sectarian tension turned darker and more violent after the prosecution service chose not to prosecute nationalists who'd breached COVID restrictions to attend the funeral of a member of the IRA. Here's Seema Katecha.
Is this what the Good Friday Agreement looks like, 23 years on from its signing? Several consecutive days of violence, stones and chunks of wood pelted at police in Northern Ireland. According to officers, some of those hiding under a mask were as young as 12. This afternoon, concerns were raised that the violence was being organised by criminal groups.
There's a degree of orchestration. Some of that may well be through social media. And again, what I would say to people is don't be sucked in by someone sitting in the safety of their own home putting messages on social media. Think about what you're doing. Last night we had an 18-year-old arrested. That's another young person in this community that is now in a police cell and the potential of a criminal conviction. We don't want to see that. So we need to take this violence off the street and address it through other mechanisms.
The scenes were reminiscent of the troubled past, and fears grew about returning to those days of unrest.
Quick, march!
From the late 1960s, sectarian violence dominated the political landscape and did so for almost 30 years. Thousands were killed. The Troubles subsided in the late 1990s. It was then that the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Unionists and nationalists agreed to form a government and work together. Once again, some of Northern Ireland's streets were reliving all too familiar scenes. Throughout Brexit discussions, the UK government reassured those worried about new border checks breaking the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. In 2019, the Prime Minister made this pledge.
There will be no forms, no checks, no barriers of any kind. You will have unfettered access.
Peace over the last 2 decades has been fractious, but it's largely held. Now there are fears violence in the region will escalate again, with increased checks on goods crossing the Irish Sea causing tension against a backdrop of lockdown frustration.
When we were talking about this in terms of a land border, we were very clear that, a return to Irish Republican violence wouldn't be justified, but it was a risk. And now I think we're seeing loyalist violence, and there's no justification for that, but that also should have been a known risk.
Some loyalists are also frustrated over a decision by the Public Prosecution Service to not prosecute those who attended the funeral of Bobby Storey last year. He was considered the IRA's former head of intelligence and was a lifelong ally of Sinn Féin's Gerry Adams. There were claims the funeral broke COVID rules, with people not socially distancing.
There has been a simmering discontent within loyalism, really across pretty much all of unionism. It straddles all political parties in unionism. It straddles all sections of unionism in terms of economic class, in terms of geographical location across Northern Ireland. Ever since the Irish Sea border was put up at the start of this year in January, that is something which has then been added to last week with this decision around no prosecutions for Sinn Féin members who were present at a massive funeral for a former IRA chief last June.
The reality of politics in Northern Ireland means tension is never far away. The violence of the last week has been confined to a handful of places with no sense of centralised organisation. The peace process agreement has held firm, but some believe the escalating issues facing the region could threaten its fragile unity.
Seema Kotecha there will join us now to discuss this further. Northern Ireland's Junior Minister in the Executive Office, Gordon Lyons of the Democratic Unionist Party, and John O'Dowd, former Acting Deputy First Minister and Sinn Féin's Chief Whip in the Assembly. Gentlemen, good to have you both with us. Thanks for joining us. Gordon Lyons, do you accept what the commentator just said? If we try and explain this more broadly to our audience, that this is about simmering discontent. It's about the economic class and how people have suffered, and it's about what they perceive to be that border down the Irish Sea. Or should you just be sending out a simple message to those committing the violence that this has to stop, end of?
Well, yes, and that's what we have done. We've been very clear that violence is not the answer to any question that might be out there right now. But I think if we're to look a little bit deeper, where does this discontent come from? It comes from two issues right now. First of all, it's the Northern Ireland Protocol, which rips up the Belfast Agreement. And it also comes from the decision by the Public Prosecution Service last week not to prosecute in terms of what happened, the funeral of the IRA chief, that Bobby Story, that had been mentioned in your report. And that has been particularly galling because of the fact that so many people in Northern Ireland had to have funerals for their loved ones, and they didn't break the rules. They followed the rules, but when it came to Sinn Féin, it seemed that different rules applied. And worse than that, the police were involved. The police helped to facilitate the funeral of Bobby Story, and it was quite clear that the regulations didn't allow what took place to take place. And so there's this great sense, not just in unionist communities, but right across the piece, that there's one rule for Sinn Féin and Republicans and another rule for everybody else.
John O'Dowd, do you accept that this is sparked by resentment by all those who showed scant regard for COVID rules attending a funeral? Michelle O'Neill herself apologised for undermining a public health message at a time when many hadn't been able to attend their own families' funerals.
Well, I think, first of all, we need to tone down the rhetoric and concentrate on those who are responsible for the violence. And that's those who are throwing paddle bombs at the police, boarding their neighbours' cars and terrorising their local communities. There is no, and we shouldn't be offering excuses on tonight's show. We're talking about a reaction to people attending the funeral of a friend. Are we seriously going to suggest that it's okay to go out and paddle bomb the police, burn your neighbour's car, terrorise your community because people weren't prosecuted for attending a funeral? So let's offer no excuse for any of that, and no one should be attempting to offer excuse for it.
I don't think they have, though, have they? I mean, Arlene Foster spoke very directly and said this has to stop. That doesn't sound like an excuse.
Well, we have calls for it to stop and then a rationale for why it's happened. And I think we've reached the stage where we have to just call for it to stop. And I think it would also be helpful if Arlene Foster, as the Joint First Minister, would agree to meet the Chief Constable. I understand today she has refused to meet the Chief Constable of the police, a police service that's under nightly attack now. And I think it would be helpful in sending out the right signals if the Joint First Minister, Arlene Foster, was agreed to meet with the police and show unity of purpose across the board, across the political spectrum, to ensure that those who are orchestrating this violence, those who are putting petrol bombs into the hands of 12-year-olds, get a very, very clear message that it's not acceptable, that they're opposed to, and that the police will have to take the action which is necessary to stop them.
Gordon Lyons, do you really have a problem with the police in Northern Ireland at the moment?
Well, I don't have a problem with the rank and file officers, and certainly my thoughts are with the 41 officers that have been injured over the course of the last number of evenings. But yes, I do have a very significant issue with the Chief Constable and his senior team, because it was that senior team that facilitated the funeral that took place in breach of the coronavirus regulations. And there has been no apology for the fact that they shouldn't have been attending the funeral. At that time, you could only attend the funeral of a family member, and there were a number of other clear breaches of the regulations. And so there have been a lot of decisions in the past that the police have made that many across the community have not been happy with. But for many, this was the last straw. The fact that there was this working together with Sinn Féin to do something that was clearly against the regulations at the time, when all of the rest of us have had to obey the rules and to follow them. So certainly I don't excuse the behaviour that went on. I want to see it come to an end. But Sinn Féin need to realise the role that they play in all of this and how their actions have stoked up tensions.
You started by saying it had come after particular difficulties with the Northern Ireland Protocol. You accept that this is, if you like, a cocktail of a difficult situation right now. What is the position with the Northern Ireland Protocol that you think will change, that will stop this?
Well, I think that we need a fundamental change to the Northern Ireland Protocol, because what the protocol does is cut Northern Ireland off from the rest of the UK. We've got these very integrated supply chains. 80% of our trade is with GB. And what has happened is that the protocol has destroyed that completely and is causing so many problems. Look at the level of checks that we have right now, even before the grace period ends. So that's what we need to focus on, and especially because, as I've already said, it just rips up the Good Friday Agreement. It changes the constitutional position of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom without the consent of the people. And the consent mechanism that has been the foundation of how we make decisions in the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive has been changed at the stroke of a pen by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and that is a huge contributing factor to the anger out there.
And John O'Dowd, presumably you sympathise with that it has been changed at the stroke of a pen, the very constitution. I mean, when Stormont's going to be recalled on Thursday, the message from the Parliament, from the Assembly, has to be speak to something deeper, doesn't it? Which is, it must be political failure when you have 12-year-olds throwing petrol bombs on the streets, which is everyone's problem there.
Well, I think it's a failure of political leadership in some circles. And again, Gordon, while in one hand condemns the violence, then gives a rationale for it. And I would appeal to people to simply condemn the violence. There is no rationale for burning your neighbour's car or throwing petrol bombs at the police in 2021. The Good Friday Agreement hasn't been changed. The Good Friday Agreement is the de facto constitution of the North and sets out our relationships north, south, east and west. My party and others warned the DUP that their support for Brexit, their support for the most ultra-right-wing conservative form of Brexit was going to cause huge problems for the island of Ireland and relationships across the board. They instead chose to spend more time engaging with English nationalists than they did with Irish nationalists. Okay. And as a result, was political failures. And I think some of this is an attempt by political unionism to hide the failings they have made in this political era. Well, they were laid in the nose by the Conservative Party. They failed their own people and they supported Brexit. Yeah,
I mean, Gordon Lyons, your party was in a position of extraordinary power within Westminster for 2 long years when you failed to take any action that could have prevented what you're seeing now. You have been the Agriculture Minister. I wonder what you're actually seeing on the ground now.
Well, first of all, I think it's important just to talk a little bit about that violence. For my part, I've always been against violence, and Sinn Féin can't say the same. Among their ranks within the Assembly, they have people who planted bombs and shot other people in the head. So I'm not going to take any lectures about violence when I've been consistent in my approach to it over the years. We were in a confidence and supply agreement with the Conservative Party for 2 years. And whenever proposals were brought before the House of Commons that separated Northern Ireland from the rest of the United Kingdom, we consistently voted against that. Only whenever Boris Johnson got an 80-seat majority in the 2019 election was he able to push through the protocol. So we've been consistent in our opposition. Yes, I was Agriculture Minister, and that's where I saw firsthand the impacts that the protocol is having on Northern Ireland, the huge increase in the number of checks, the amount of paperwork, and the delay and disruption that is taking place. That didn't have to be the case. The protocol was not the answer to the problem, and it needs to go for it to get stability in Northern Ireland.
We're out of time, but thank you both very much. Thanks for joining us.